Never forget that intelligence rules the world, and ignorance carries the burden. Therefore, remove yourself as far as possible from ignorance and seek as far as possible to be intelligent. Marcus Garvey.
Teachers, I don't think they know the role that they play. Just so that you care. And I guarantee you those kids, you're going to see a great impact. Kids that sleep, they don't look at it a whole different way. Children, they're the future. So why not? If they're the future, why not make the future the best future? Why not make it great? You're knowing that these children, everyone goes to school. You have to be educated. And you see you see what's going on in the world. And that's what I want to make a difference. That's what's pushing me. It's not anything else. I need to touch these kids. I need to get to these kids' minds. Because it's a lot of them, they're misled. And it's crazy. And it's so crazy, man. All you gotta do is have that one teacher. And I swear, man, it'll change your whole mindset. Your whole mindset. You'll just go through life positive.
Writing and arithmetic, taught to the tune of a hickory stick. You were my queen in calico, I was your bashful barefoot foe, and you wrote on my slate, I love you, Joe, when we were a couple of kids.
Brought from the African wilds to constitute the laboring class of a pioneering society in the New World, the heathen slaves had to be trained to meet the needs of their new environment. Carter Woodson.
In the earliest days of slavery, slave owners would not allow their new slaves to speak their native languages or practice their native religions. At first, slave owners believed that slaves who became familiar with their new surroundings and understood the language of their owners would be more valuable than those who could not communicate. The question became then, what kind of training should the slaves get and to what degree? In their view, the downside of training would be that education would foster a longing for liberty. In addition, many slave owners maintained the belief that the more brutal the approach to their slaves, the easier it would become to exploit their services. It was this way of thinking that finally convinced the majority of Southerners that the education of enslaved Africans should not occur. Slaves, however, saw the idea of education much differently. One misconception about the newly arrived slaves was that they lacked education. In reality, they had come from cultures where education was an integral part of their African heritage. The African approach involved focusing on the cultural, physical, spiritual, social, and moral development of the children, the purpose of which was to make each child a good citizen of the community. One example of how this was accomplished can be seen in the importance of griots in early pre-colonization African education. Griots were the early teachers, storytellers, and troubadours whose job was to receive, preserve, and transmit the ideas, knowledge, history, and cultural norms of the group from one generation to the next. However, for blacks in the antebellum South, to learn how to read, write, and do arithmetic was a revolutionary act. Slaves who attempted to educate themselves, if caught, suffered severe physical and psychological consequences. Nonetheless, even under strict limitations of slavery, slaves found and created ingenious ways to educate themselves. Some slaves received their education from pit schools, so named because they were pits in the ground far out in the woods, away from the eyes of the slave master. Others would hide their spelling books under their hats so that when the opportunity presented itself, they could bribe a literate person to teach them. Still, other slave children, who had to carry the books of white children to school, would sit outside, listen, and try to keep up with the lessons. It was not uncommon for literate slaves to share their learning. Some slaves who worked for business establishments were educated by assisting clerks in their places of work, while others learned from fellow slaves. As a result, they were often called upon to teach the children of their masters. In Virginia, black teachers taught in schools for freed persons and opened the first black secondary school. During this time period, more than 1/3 of all the teachers in Virginia schools were black. Although unable to experience an education such as they received in their homeland, many black educators used whatever means necessary to retain those connections to their former lives and adapt to their new circumstances. Some went to great lengths, some to simple solutions, while one just lent her name. One of the many and more creative efforts to assist in the education of slaves was the story of Reverend John Berry Meacham. John Meacham was born into slavery in Goochland County, Virginia in 1789. As his master migrated from North Carolina to Kentucky, Meacham developed his carpentry skills, which eventually enabled him to purchase his own freedom and that of his father. While in Kentucky, he met and married a slave named Mary, whom he followed to St. Louis when her master relocated, and he was eventually able to buy her freedom. Always a religious man, Meacham was ordained into the ministry by John Mason Peck, a Baptist missionary. Meacham opened and became the pastor of the first black church west of the Mississippi, later known as the First Baptist Church of St. Louis. Meacham also opened various locations around St. Louis to provide for the education of both free and slave black children. As tensions grew regarding the issue of slavery, St. Louis officials saw the practice of teaching slave children to read as a subversive activity. In the early 1820s, the St. Louis City Board of Education passed an ordinance that prohibited the education of either free or enslaved blacks.
All meetings of Negroes or mulattoes, for the purpose mentioned in the above section, shall be considered unlawful assemblages and shall be suppressed by sheriffs, constables, and other public officials.
Although this ordinance was enforced only sporadically, local opposition of Meacham's efforts grew. Eventually, in 1847, The slave state of Missouri banned all education for black people and prohibited them from having independent black religious services without a white law enforcement officer present. In response, the ever-resourceful Meacham moved his clandestine tallow school classes to a steamboat he had purchased, outfitted with a library, desks, and chairs. He then moved it to the middle of the Mississippi River, which was beyond the legal boundaries of the state of Missouri and in federal territory. He named his steamboat the Floating Freedom School. John Meacham was not the only nor the last black educator to take a personal and hands-on approach to the education of blacks. Another of those teachers who hailed from Virginia was Haley Quinn Brown. Brown, the daughter of former slaves, was born in Pittsburgh in 1849. From the time of her birth, Brown seemed to be in perpetual motion. By the time she was 28, she had lived in Pittsburgh, Chatham, Canada, South Carolina, Mississippi, back to Ohio, then Virginia and Tuskegee, Alabama. Along the way, she earned a Bachelor of Science degree from Wilberforce University, and later in 1887, she earned a Master of Science degree from her alma mater, Wilberforce, being the first black woman to do so. Her first teaching job was on a plantation in South Carolina, teaching a group of children from neighboring plantations. According to her biography,
Brown's plantation school had no windows, but it was well ventilated and the rain beat in fiercely. Not being successful in getting the authorities to fix the building, she secured the willing service of 2 of her larger students. She mounted one mule and the 2 boys another, and thus they rode to the gin mill. They got cottonseed, returned, and mixed it with earth, which formed a plastic mortar, and with her own hands she pasted up the holes.
Born February 20th, 1943, in Topeka, Kansas, Linda Brown's last name became associated with one of the most influential Supreme Court decisions connected with the racial desegregation of American schools. The neighborhood which Linda Brown lived in was fairly diverse, mostly white with some blacks, Hispanic, and Indian families. At the time in Topeka, there were 22 schools, 18 for white students and 4 for black students. When she started school, although she lived only 3 blocks away from the Sumner School, one of the schools for white students, she had to travel an hour and a half each way to get to Monroe School, the school for black students. Linda's father was angry and concerned about her unsafe journey his daughter had to make each day of school. During the summer, when Linda was 7, Sumner School had placed registration forms for all students in the mailboxes on Linda Street. In September of 1951, 7-year-old Linda and her father, Oliver Brown, a pastor at the local African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, walked to Sumner School to register Linda and was refused registration. Brown was one of the 13 black parents who were encouraged by the NAACP to try to enroll their children from Topeka's 4 black schools into some of the 18 all-white schools. The refusal allowed Oliver Brown to join with the other black parents to become part of a larger group of other civil rights lawsuits, coordinated and supported by the NAACP, into one lawsuit that later became known as Brown versus the Board of Education. Brown became the lead name, as it was the first name when all the plaintiffs' names were listed alphabetically. There were several tenets to the group of cases: school location and conditions, quality of schools for black students as compared to schools for white students, and most importantly, how separate schools were psychologically damaging to black children. As the cases wound themselves through the legal system, along the way there were victories and losses for both sides. One of the most memorable lines spoken in defense of the Brown lawsuit was that of James Nabrett of the NAACP.
Our Constitution has no provisions across it that all men are created equal, but that white men are more equal than others.
Finally, on Monday, May 17, 1954, Chief Justice Earl Warren announced that a decision had been rendered in the case of Brown versus Board of Education. Near the end of the opinion, Chief Justice Warren stated,
"To separate black children from others of similar age and qualifications solely because of their race generates a feeling of inferiority as to their status in the community that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely ever to be undone. We conclude unanimously that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal."
In the end, the Brown victory was but a small victory in a series of bigger battles. However, an unintended and negative outcome of the Brown case greatly influenced an important piece of the educational system, the hiring of black teachers. In 1954, the year of the Brown versus Board of Education decision, there were approximately 82,000 African American teachers in the United States responsible for the education of over 2 million African American students. 10 years later, after the decision, over 38,000 black teachers and administrators had lost their jobs as white superintendents began to integrate schools, but balked at putting black educators in positions of authority over white teachers or students. The issue of the integration of schools at the expense of the jobs of black teachers was unsettling for many. Darla Buchanan was one teacher caught up in the turmoil. She received a letter from Wendell Godwin, superintendent of the Topeka, Kansas schools. It began,
"The majority of people in Topeka will not want to employ Negro teachers for next year for white children. Due to the uncertainty of our enrollment next year in schools for Negro students, it is not possible at this time to offer you employment for the next year."
The loss of black teaching jobs as an unintended consequence after the Brown versus Board of Education decision is one example of a pattern of behavior that has impacted the field of education for both black and white teachers. Since the 1960s, the decrease in the number of students entering a teacher education program has become a troubling trend. As of 2010, the total national enrollments in teacher education programs have decreased as much as 40%. The reasons for the gap are many, but they begin with a general societal view of the negative perceptions of the teaching profession that can be seen in the general decline of college students choosing to go into education. One reason, according to Dr. Lori Ellis Piper, Dean of the College of Education at Northern Illinois University, is that teaching is not seen as an appealing career for young people.
There's actually a national trend that there's a 40% decrease in the number of young people going into education across the U.S. I think there are a number of reasons for that. I think one of them is that teaching has not been presented as a particularly appealing career for young people. I think a lot of what we see in the media and the popular press, a lot of what we see in television and movies presents teaching as a fairly difficult, underappreciated profession, and I think a lot of young people see that and question whether they want to go that direction. I think also the perception that it's a low-paid, low-status profession is one that we really need to combat. I think in addition to that, there also is a perception that being a teacher is exceptionally hard, and they hear about all of the challenges and the limited funding and the higher expectations and the new standards and the shifting demographics, and I think they hear about all the challenging aspects, and I think it might feel overwhelming to some of them. And I also think that some of our best and brightest students are steered away from going into education, which I think is just really a tragedy. I also think that sometimes the structure of teacher education programs can feel overwhelming for young people. So the requirements for admission, the requirements in terms of having certain test scores to be admissible into programs, knowing that there are going to be requirements that you can't necessarily work a lot because you're going to be doing clinical experiences and student teaching. I think a lot of those variables also discourage a number of students from going into education.
The number of black students in particular, majoring in education, completing a program and graduating with a teaching certificate has been particularly impacted. 25% fewer black teacher candidates were enrolled in teacher education programs in 2018 than in 2010. Additionally, white students majoring in education have a 73% graduation rate compared to 42% for black students. But the decrease in the enrollment of black students in education programs and their completion rates are just two of many issues impacting the lack of black teachers. Those issues and concerns begin long before black students enter college with their experiences in elementary and high school education.
Thinking about school districts, particularly urban school districts, if we're talking about children of color. And what I've seen is the school districts may not serve these students to the best of that student's potential. And it doesn't necessarily mean it's intentional. But I do believe that a lot of our school districts are lacking cultural competency. So although the school district aggregates and disaggregates and reports and tests and codes by race and class, it's not very likely to have understood that system of racism and classism. So that not knowing, that not seeing, still impacts the student learning in the environment. And so for children of color, children in poverty, trans children, any group that's marginalized, that can be a very hostile environment for them. And so why go back into that place where you may have had a very, like I said earlier, unsatisfying experience or a very traumatic experience? You don't go back to places where you were not welcome.
Research shows that black students benefit from having just one black teacher, both academically and socially, in their earliest grades in school. The lack of black teachers has been associated with substandard academic performance and disproportionate discipline among black students, especially black males. Black males are 3 times more likely to be disciplined than their white counterparts. However, black students who have just one black teacher in elementary school are more likely to both graduate from high school and enroll in college. Black teachers are more likely to place black students in gifted and AP education programs and often act as role models, surrogate parents, disciplinarians, counselors, and advocates for their black students. Additionally, black students with racially diverse teachers have fewer absences and are less likely to be chronically truant.
Being able to relate to the student is critically important, and understanding that student's culture. Behaviors sometimes are different amongst cultures for various reasons. So I see that there is a difference. I acknowledge there's a difference, and I think a lot of the discipline that is being delivered because of lack of understanding a particular culture. So if we increased the number of minority teachers, I think you will see a significant change. I should say more definitively, there will be a significant change. When you look at the leadership changes that occur in public schools, when there is a high population of African American students in a given school, and there is a shift in the administration of that school, and the diversity changes occur where there's more minority teachers, you will see a reduction in the disciplinary referrals that are going to the principal. Not that all of those referrals will be eliminated, but there is something to be said for understanding why a student is behaving the way they are. I'll give you a personal example. When my youngest stepson was in school in 3rd grade, the teachers thought that he was a behavior problem. It turns out that he was just bored. He was very bored in the class because he was a gifted student. We didn't know he was gifted until we had him tested. And there's research that shows similar so-called discipline problem child exhibits the same behaviors as children who are gifted. Fortunately, the principal of the school recognized that, and he was the one that encouraged that my wife have my stepson tested for the gifted program. And he's now an MD. He's at a teaching college in Evansville, Indiana. So just having someone in place who could recognize it's more than just this child who happens to be a black male is acting out, that principal was educated enough as far as being more culturally sensitive to ask the question, well, is there something more to this than just that child's behavior?
Many communities have worked to address the lack of black teachers and their impact on students, especially black males. One such effort to increase the number of black teachers in their community has been organized in Rockford, Illinois, between the Rockford Public Schools and Rockford University. Rockford is the 3rd largest city in Illinois and lies about 100 miles west of Chicago, straddling the Rock River. With a population of 145,000, its demographics and social issues are not unlike many other urban cities in America. It is a city divided physically by a river and by a number of social, economic, and educational concerns, leading to the East Side, West Side mentality. Despite having named the city's newest school after Constance Lane, Rockford's first African-American teacher, the history of discrimination in Rockford and the Rockford Public Schools is historic, systemic, and sadly, still occurring. Its public education system has a history, according to one federal judge, as having raised discrimination to an art form. Referendums and legal entanglements have been part of the history of Rockford education for decades. In 1989, the first of numerous lawsuits was filed against the district by a group of citizens who became known as People Who Care, which began the numerous court battles over the years involving the school district and involved citizen groups that lasted until 2002, eventually costing the citizens of Rockford $252 million in court-ordered remedies. Another of the outcomes of the People Who Care lawsuit in 1991 was the Rockford School District was directed by a federal judge to hire more minority teachers. 25 years after the court's ruling, on April 26, 2016, the Rockford School Board approved a plan to partner with Rockford University to recruit and build a diverse teaching workforce from within the student body of Rockford students that mirrors the students and community of Rockford. The program, to be called the Education Pathways Program, was formally announced to the public at a press conference on December 12, 2016, that included the Rockford Public Schools Superintendent, Dr. Aaron Jarrett, and Rockford University President, Dr. Eric Fulcomer. Superintendent Jarrett describes the Pathways program as an opportunity for Rockford to build a teaching force that mirrors the community of Rockford and addresses many of the inequities within the Rockford educational system. For example, as of 2019, the racial makeup of Rockford Public Schools was 32% black students and 29% white students, while the teaching breakdown was 86% white teachers and only 4% black teachers. The racial makeup of teachers in the district has remained virtually unchanged for the past 10 years. According to Superintendent Jarrett, the program will also provide financial and educational support for the high school seniors chosen for the program.
The Pathway program that we built with Rockford University is our attempt to create a long-term generational solution to a challenge that we don't think we can recruit our way out of in the Rockford Public Schools. The program starts with an on-ramp where we start recruiting students, not formally, but with the idea of becoming a teacher as early as elementary school and middle school. We then move into our pathway component where sophomore, junior, and senior year students take a 3-year sequence of courses that are education related as one of their elective pathways. Upon graduation, Rockford University is offered a $5,000 or a $10,000 a year tuition cost, which is anywhere between a $20,000 and $25,000 a year discount for students accepted into the program, depending on whether they have Pell and MAP grant status. And upon hire with the district following a student teaching experience, we've committed to a master's degree during the spring of their first year of teaching that would add another $50,000 in benefits. So we're looking at a value proposition for our own students, investing approximately $150,000 in each one of those candidates with the idea that that could be the way to have gender and socioeconomic and racial balance in our teaching force. We have about 60 teachers retire every year. The pathway was designed for 20. We think this is an incredibly important first step. But I grew very, very weary of trying to recruit our way out. I don't think if you go in the state of Illinois, the numbers are very, very disheartening. And if you go nationwide, it's not much better. So we felt like rather than investing those dollars in what we believed was probably not going to be a long-term solution, we thought the best way to invest the dollars was in our own student body, which we know reflects the diversity of our community. And I'm so appreciative of our board. I'm appreciative of Rockford University for their long-term vision to make this investment. And it takes that kind of sustained long-term commitment to change a problem that I think, frankly, is a generational change issue as opposed to a quick fix. This is not going to be a strategy where anyone's going to be throwing a parade for success within the first 6 months or the first year. We know the earliest years are going to be the greatest challenges.
Rockford University is a private liberal arts college founded in 1847 as Rockford Female Seminary. Even from its early beginnings, as the name implies, it has always been an educational pioneer. The very fact that it was a higher educational institution exclusively for women sparked great debate. Many believed that it would destroy the role of women as homemaker, wives, and mothers, while others believed that a highly educated woman, at her best, would be a better homemaker. Its effort to provide an educational curriculum equal to that of men's colleges was seen as a groundbreaking endeavor. The results of those efforts materialized in 1882, when Rockford Female Seminary graduated its first bachelor's degrees to a group of women that also included future founder of Chicago Hull House and the first woman to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, Jane Addams. Much as the original Rockford Female Seminary's goal was seen as a bold effort, current Rockford University president, Dr. Eric Fulkemer, sees the Pathways program as a unique program that can be a model for other communities across the country.
The Education Pathway program is really a phenomenal program, and as I talk about it with civic groups, with others, everybody seems to immediately be intrigued and start asking questions about it. My understanding is that this is rather distinctive in our country. There aren't a lot of programs like this, and so it's pretty exciting. There are many benefits to having, I think, teachers that look like the students in the classroom. And so we know that the majority of teachers are white females. In fact, 80% of the students in teacher education programs today are white. But the majority of students, the majority of students are still white in high schools and middle schools and elementary schools, there's a growing percentage of minority students, and they don't see teachers like themselves. And if you don't see a teacher like yourself, you maybe have a lack of respect for authority. You certainly don't see yourself becoming a teacher yourself because you don't see that. So I think it would be really important for minority teachers to enter the workforce, to be mentors to students, to encourage them to consider this profession, and so that students can see people like themselves in positions of authority. If I could summarize it quickly, I would say that the goal is, through high school, the teachers and the administration will work with students to identify 20 students who would be excellent students to go into the Education Pathways program. And so Rockford University has made available 20 spots per year for these students to come and get a 4-year degree in teacher education. And then throughout that time, the school district will support those students, give them opportunities for summer jobs, make sure that they do their observations in the Rockford Public Schools, and of course do their student teaching in the Rockford Public Schools. So we're identifying a number of ways that will support students in the Education Pathway program, both at Rockford University and in the Rockford Public Schools. First and foremost, the Rockford Public Schools have committed to supporting these students throughout their time at Rockford University. So they're not just going to identify them in 8th grade, work with them through high school, and then send them off. They're going to continue to be involved with them. I know that we've identified opportunities for them to do work at the Rockford Public Schools, summer jobs, connect with current teachers, so some type of mentoring program would be really helpful. On the college campus, we have a number of services in place for all of our students. We have a Student Success and Retention Office that identifies students at risk and helps to create pathways for them to be successful. Those who are in need of that will receive those services through our Student Success and Retention. The faculty and the education department and across the university will be wanting to support these students and make sure that they're successful, as we do for all of our students. So I think there's a number of things in place, both in Rockford Public Schools and at Rockford University, to help these students be successful.